Has this ever happened to you? I have a brand new water bottle and I can see too much of it. A blank water bottle can be an unsightly bore. Luckily, using our patented technology, there is a solution. There is? There sure is. It's called stickers. These incredible devices are covered in glue on one end and funny, attractive designs on the other. They are the ideal solution for any water bottle in need of a little pizzazz. How do I acquire these stickers? Well, fictional customer, I'm glad you asked. Just go to wildgreenmemes.com, that's wildgreenmemes.com, to grab your very own wild green stickers. Wow, thanks, mister. Now what do I do about my fridge? Just wait until we tell this guy about magnets. wildgreenmemes.com.
This is Wild Green Streams. I'm Rhett, and today on the show we have Ben Goldfarb, author of Crossings, How Road Ecology is Shaping the Future of Our Planet, an excellent book in this month's entry in the Wild Green Book Club. Ben, welcome to the pod.
Hey, thanks a lot, Rhett, and thanks for choosing my book for the book club. I so appreciate it.
The book is about the ecology of roads and how they interact with the world around them. What led you to this topic?
Yeah, it's a great question. You know, a couple of answers. First, as an environmental journalist, I'm always writing about conservation and wildlife and ecology. And you start to realize that roads underpin so many different environmental issues, right? Before you can illegally log the Amazon, you have to build roads into the Amazon to get the machinery in and the logs out. Before you can poach an elephant, you have to access the elephant somehow. Before you can drill for oil and gas, you need a road network supporting that industrial activity, right? So in that sense, roads are kind of at the heart of all of these different ecological issues, and yet we don't really talk about them very much. I think because they're so ubiquitous. We use them every day. They're fundamentally useful, right? They're how we get to schools and hospitals and grocery stores and so on. And so roads are just such a staple of our daily lives that we don't really think about them much in a conservation context, or at least not as much as we should. And I think that was largely what led me to writing this book, was to take these features that we don't pay enough attention to, and let's shine some light on them.
I remember when I was in undergrad for ecology, one of my friends did a mini study of eastern diamondback rattlesnakes, and one of the critiques that the study got was that it only considered the question in the vicinity of roads. But I always thought that question was kind of moot, because there is almost nowhere within their range where they're not within the vicinity of a road.
Yeah, exactly right. I think that gets at another fascinating idea too, which is that scientists use roads, right? Roads are, that idea of like herp cruising, driving roads looking for snakes or turtles or what have you. It's I've heard so many herpetologists who are like, yeah, that's my kind of fundamental field method. So in that sense, roads are also these facilitators of research. Scientists use roads too, just like anybody else.
Yeah, a lot of the book, I really appreciated the travelogue style of it, where it would have these little instances where you drop down into a place and go out with the researchers or where the people there. A lot of it was you kind of going out on these trips. And honestly, that I feel like describing the book, it can sound a little bit heavy, but I feel like your presentation did a great job of lightening that load and making it enjoyable to read. Do you have any experiences that didn't make it in that you wish had?
Oh man, that's a that's a really good question. Well, one experience that I had after the book was published was I had a chance to go down to South Texas to look for ocelots and ocelot crossings. Ocelots are one of the most road endangered animals on Earth. There are something like 100 ocelots left in the United States, and roadkill is around 40% of ocelot mortality. So it's this huge toll on this really rare endangered cat. So I had a chance to go down to Texas and hang out with some of the researchers who were trying to understand ocelot movement patterns and figure out, where they're approaching or crossing roads, and where wildlife crossings would help support them, and whether they're using the existing wildlife crossings. And we didn't see any ocelots in the flesh. They're pretty elusive, as you might imagine. But we definitely checked some camera traps that had ocelots on them, and knowing that we were standing in the same places as these amazing, gorgeous, incredibly rare animals had been 24 hours earlier. That was really a thrill.
So how do crossings work?
Yeah, so wildlife crossings are really any structure that allow animals to get safely from one side of the highway to another. So everything from a giant wildlife overpass, a big bridge essentially, to a kind of an open underpass, a dirt floored underpass that they can move through, to a culvert. Many tropical countries have canopy bridges, these kinds of rope ladders that primates and sloths and other animals can move across highways on. So wildlife crossings, just any structure that animals are using to move across a road. Typically there are fences on either side of the crossing, so that the fences kind of guide the animals to the passages. And we know that wildlife crossings work incredibly well. At this point there's been decades of research, showing that when you put in crossings and wildlife fences, you typically see roadkill reductions of 90% or more, and that these animal movements, these migrations that are so important for wildlife populations, are able to continue. That animals can safely cross those roads. So we know that wildlife crossings are beneficial, and now we need a whole lot more of them.
Yeah, I feel like in sort of the same way that roads themselves are almost invisible by being ubiquitous, I feel like roadkill is as well. What's the scale of the problem with roadkill?
Yeah, I think you're exactly right about roadkill being invisible, and I think that's for a couple of reasons. First, one of the ironies of the car is that it both obliterates animals, but it also conceals that violence from us, right? I mean, imagine sitting in the cab of an F-150, and you're just racing along at 70 miles an hour, and you're sealed in your little glass and metal bubble. You just don't see a lot of critters, especially those smaller animals, right? Yeah, maybe you see the deer or the elk or the bigger animals, but you don't really notice those songbirds or rodents or amphibians or reptiles. So I think you're right that roadkill is kind of invisible in a lot of ways, which masks the true toll of the problem. But we know that at least 1 million vertebrate animals, so that's just backboned animals, right, are killed every day by cars in the U.S. Yeah, it's kind of a staggering figure, and and certainly a lot of those animals are abundant critters, gray squirrels and raccoons and white-tailed deer. But we also know that lots of really rare species, threatened and endangered species, are existentially at risk due to roads, from ocelots that I mentioned, to Florida panthers, to Hawaiian geese, to tiger salamanders. I mean, yeah, roads are really one of the major driving forces behind this kind of sixth extinction event that we're in.
It's interesting given the scale of that threat. And also, I guess I should have you speak before I ask this question about the impact on people of having these collisions with wildlife. So is it true that deer are among the deadliest animals in North America?
Yeah, white-tailed deer are the single most dangerous wild animal in North America, and it's not the deer's fault, right? It's the car's fault in a sense. But we know that more than 400 drivers are killed every year in deer vehicle collisions, and others die hitting bears and moose and elk and other big animals. And that's a really an underestimate, right? I've talked to state troopers who say, yeah, probably a lot of fatal single car crashes are wildlife related, right? Somebody swerves to avoid a deer late at night and hits a telephone pole or a tree, and doesn't survive to tell the story. But that's an animal related fatality as well. I mean, we know that the average deer collision costs society more than $9,000 in hospital bills and vehicle repairs and insurance costs and so on. The average elk collision is more than $20,000. Average moose collision is more than $40,000. And collectively, all of these animal crashes are costing America more than 10 billion. That's with a B, dollars every year, right? So this is this huge kind of unsung public health and safety crisis, as well as a conservation crisis.
Given the scale of that impact, not just on wildlife but on people, and on property with the car damage, it's interesting to me how idiosyncratic a lot of these stories about what it took to make a crossing are, that it's not just a standard part of building roads. There is a wildlife culvert that works as an underpass that was built on Lake Jackson in my neck of the woods, and I've actually driven over it and had no idea it was there before. But just to give people a little bit of an idea of what it can take to build just one small crossing the way things are now, can you talk about the story behind that culvert?
Yeah, I'm really glad you brought that up, because that's one of my favorite stories in the book, because it is so impressive and inspiring. So that culvert was really pushed for by a herpetologist named Matt Oresco, and Matt and his, I guess, then girlfriend, now wife, documented this huge turtle mortality event in the early 2000s, where basically, the highway runs between these kind of two sections of Lake Jackson, these two lobes of Lake Jackson. Turtles were moving from one side of the lake to the other across the highway, in between them, and just getting mowed down by cars. Obviously, turtles are, not the fastest animals in the world, not the best road crossers. And so, Matt, for a while, he was out there, every day, basically picking up turtles in those big Rubbermaid tubs and running through traffic to the other side to move these animals. And he moved, hundreds, if not thousands, of turtles that way. I forget the exact numbers, but just some staggering number of turtles. But he knew the whole time that was just a temporary solution. You can't just go moving turtles by hand forever. And so he was, pushing the Florida Department of Transportation to put in an underpass, a culvert with a wall alongside it that would funnel those turtles under the highway, between the two sides of the lake. And at first, I think the state was kind of resistant or indifferent, didn't really provide a whole lot of support. But Matt just mobilized and organized this incredible group of supporters, people who wrote letters from all over the world to the state of Florida, asking for a culvert for turtles, a turtle tunnel. And, finally, after that big, sort of public pressure campaign, they did it. They put in a couple of culverts and a concrete wall. And, that basically took turtle roadkill to zero. A pretty incredible conservation story. And one of the things that I loved about that was that he would, Matt had tagged the turtles that he was moving, and of course turtles are these incredibly long-lived animals, and so for years and years afterward, I think to this day, he'll hear from somebody saying, "Hey, I saw one of your tagged turtles in the neighborhood," or I found one of your tags in the belly of an alligator. So it's just I think it was just cool to know that these turtles were still moving around the landscape, playing their part in the ecosystem.
That's awesome. I love hearing about researchers that research a long-lived animal and then they wind up having these kind of lifelong relationships with the individuals sometimes.
Me too. I love those sorts of stories. Yeah, I mean, I'm working on a book now about fish migration, and I was just out on a shark tagging trip out of Miami with researchers who are putting acoustic tags in sharks, and so cool to know that they're going to be following those animals around their entire lives. Really, I love those kinds of relationships too.
That's awesome. Why is the U.S. Forest Service the manager of the biggest road network on Earth?
Oh boy, yeah, that's a kind of a fascinating history, and I think that's a fact that a lot of people don't realize, right? When we think about road managers, we probably think about the Federal Highway Administration, but in fact, there are close to 400,000 miles of Forest Service road, and that really dates back to the Forest Service's early mission as a facilitator of industrial logging. Those roads were primarily logging roads. In many cases, the private timber companies themselves actually built those roads, which the Forest Service, essentially permitted. And so, those roads, they're still out on the landscape. There are national forests in Idaho and Montana, these places that we think of as, kind of remote wilderness that have higher road densities than New York City. which is just a mind-blowing fact. And those roads, of course, those all of those old dirt logging roads, they don't see a ton of traffic, but there's still big ecological or hydrological issues. They invite people into grizzly bear country, which results in conflict with bears and often bear mortality. Those dirt roads are constantly eroding and putting sediment into streams and smothering fish eggs and amphibian larvae and impacting downstream water quality. So just because a road isn't a giant busy interstate highway doesn't mean it's not having pretty big impacts.
Kind of a similar revelation in the book that I had never considered was that the roads in the national parks, because they're designed to see these big vistas, are kind of designed to spread sound as far as possible across the landscape. What's going on with that? Like, what is the significance of road noise?
Yeah, road noise is this huge disruptor to wild animals. Animals, of course, live in this really sensitive acoustic environment. Something that Ed Young writes a lot about in An Immense World, his great book about sensory ecology, right? But the idea that animals have these incredibly sensitive senses that we don't fully appreciate or understand, and hearing is one of the most important ones, right? I mean, think about being an owl who has to listen for the rustle of a rodent's footsteps in the leaf litter, or a meadowlark who has to sing to attract a mate, right? If you can't hear, and you're an owl, you fundamentally can't hunt in that place. If you're a meadowlark and your mate can't hear you over the noise of engines and tires, that's a loss of habitat effectively, right? So a road might only be 100 feet wide from shoulder to shoulder, but that kind of acoustic envelope that it's casting, all of that noise pollution billowing into the environment, is a huge impact. And probably the best study that looked at this, which I talk about in the book, is this project called the Phantom Road Experiment. This was basically this project where researchers at Boise State University recorded road noise from Glacier National Park, right? So again, this is not I-90 or some big highway. This is going to the Sun Road, a road in a quote unquote protected area, and then they played those recordings of road noise through speakers in an unroaded forest in Idaho. And then they looked at bird response to that noise being piped into the environment. And what they found was that, not surprisingly, birds avoided that area, and the birds who did stick around were in worse body condition, because if you're surrounded by road noise, you can't hear the sound of an approaching predator. You have to look for your predator instead, and that means you're not spending as much time foraging. And so that was just a fascinating study, because it really isolated that one variable, the impacts of road noise, and found that that noise alone has a really serious effect on songbirds in particular.
So with roadkill, road mortality, you could imagine a world where there are a lot of crossings and there are ways to mitigate that. How can we mitigate sound pollution?
Yeah, it's a really tough one. I mean, certainly there are answers to that. People often say, well, what about electric vehicles, right? But the issue is that at highway speeds, most road noise is actually from tires, not from engines. So EVs won't totally solve the problem. There's some material solutions. For example, sort of noise dampening pavements that reduce tire noise. But I think that the most important solution is just having less cars out there, right? And that's especially true again in those protected areas. Those national parks. I mean, we think about national parks as being places where animals are safe, right? And they are safe from hunting and development and other pressures, but they're not safe from roads, right? Yellowstone, Yosemite, Glacier, they all have roads running right through the middle of them. And so, I think that the real solution in those protected areas, especially, is to just get people out of their private cars and put them on public transit. In the book I visit Denali National Park, which did that. Which basically prohibited most private vehicles and instituted a bus system. And that's a place that just has incredible soundscapes, because there are only a handful of buses moving pretty slowly along the road there. So I'd love to see that sort of thing become the rule rather than the exception.
I think the most effective measure of how impactful that silence was the point in the book where you got off the bus in Denali and it sounds like you forgot to take notes. Like you just had like some random stray words here and there afterwards.
Yeah, because I mean, it is such an awesome experience, to be alone with, the noise of the sound rather, because noise and sound. I think about sound as being fundamentally natural and noise as being kind of a form of anthropogenic pollution. But it's just amazing to be alone with the sound of the wind and the birds, and that's not an experience that we really have a whole lot anymore. We're kind of surrounded by road noise. I think that's an important point too, is that road noise is this big impact on wildlife and on conservation, but it's also an impact on human lives as well. There's lots of research showing that road noise pollution is elevating our cortisol levels and our blood pressures and our risks of stroke and cardiac disease and all of these issues, right? I mean, road noise is taking literally millions of years off of our collective lifespans. And so, the opportunity to be in a place that is fundamentally quiet is a really beautiful thing, and not an opportunity we have often enough.
Do you think is a way forward? What do you think is a way that we can kind of mitigate these problems, or how should the world look? Maybe what should we learn from Brazil about road ecology?
Yeah, it's a really good question, because look, I think you're right that roads are just part of the landscape. They're unavoidable to an extent, of course. There are places where roads are being decommissioned and obliterated, and that's great. And of course, I in the book I write a lot more. I write a lot about how we can increase road decommissioning and decrease the density of roads on the landscape, especially on national forests and other public lands. But at the end of the day, we're kind of stuck with this infrastructure to a very large extent, and I really try to avoid being sanctimonious about that or holier than thou. I've driven thousands and thousands of miles, promoting my book about the ills of driving, right? We're all kind of trapped in this system together. And so, I feel like, there are two answers to your question, right? Like what should the landscape look like? And, I think so first, I think that in urban and suburban areas, we absolutely need so much more pedestrian and cycling infrastructure and public transit infrastructure, right? Let's create a world where it's safe and comfortable to be a cyclist or a pedestrian, or to ride the bus or the train. So that's great. But then I think about places like where I live, rural Colorado, where towns are 20 miles apart from each other. There's unfortunately there's no bus system that's going to replace the role of the car in Chaffee County, Colorado, right? Yeah, we can expand public service for transit, but we're mostly stuck with the car out here, and that's a challenge because these rural places are where the wildlife is, right? We've got big herds of deer and elk and antelope, and so in these rural places, especially, I think really improving that wildlife crossing infrastructure, allowing animals to move safely around the landscape, I think is so important. So that's really what I want to see, is more public transit, especially in those urban and suburban places, better wildlife crossing infrastructure, in those places where, the car is kind of entrenched, so that when we do inevitably drive, it's not kind of an ecological apocalypse. And, since you mentioned Brazil, I mean, that was one of my favorite places I went in working on this book. And, there's I think a lot we can learn from other countries, how they approach this issue. But, one of the cool things about Brazil, which is a country that does have a lot of wildlife crossings, is that they actually have this legal system where, if you're driving down the highway and you hit a tapir or a capybara, and it does a bunch of damage to your car, you can actually sue the road operator for damages, basically say like, hey, you should have put in fences and wildlife crossings. This is a problem we know how to solve. It's an infrastructural problem, and the operators of the infrastructure should be responsible for preventing it. And I love that sort of placement of liability, which says, hey, this isn't, this is a public safety issue that infrastructural creators are required to mitigate. And that's not an approach that we take here in the US necessarily, but we probably should.
Yeah, I think that's an awesome idea. I was The idea in general of looking to countries that we typically would think of as less developed for solutions to this was such a cool thought in the book too. You had it like India has monkey crossings as well. There are these nets above the roads.
Yeah, exactly. Right. And, in India, has some canopy crossings. Certainly Brazil, when I was down there, I saw these amazing networks of rope ladders, for howler monkeys and other primates. I know Kenya has done that work. Costa Rica, many places have put in those canopy crossings. Australia has a bunch of them for squirrel gliders, these little arboreal marsupials. And that's something that we can do in the U.S. too, right? We've got flying squirrels and martins and porcupines and all kinds of critters that would use a canopy crossing, but we haven't really done that, and let's start. Let's start getting more creative about the species that we're facilitating.
Yeah. So speaking of facilitation, what do you think of using road size as migration corridors for monarchs?
Yeah, it's a really good question, and there's a chapter of the book about that. As you know, I mean, it's an interesting tension because look, in states like Iowa and Illinois, roadsides are the largest form of public land, right? The rest of the landscape is kind of corn and soy and lawn monoculture. And those roadsides are these strips of prairie with lots of milkweed and other resources. So that's good. At the same time, obviously the road's a dangerous place, and those roadsides can lure animals into perilous situations. I mean, millions of monarch butterflies are killed during their Midwestern migration every year by cars. We don't really think about insects as being roadkill, but it's a huge source of mortality. So you have to be conscious of making sure that roads and roadsides are providing more productivity than they're costing, right? And how do we manage them better too? I've read about projects looking at maybe you want to plant your roadside pollinator friendly plants a little bit further from the shoulder, a little bit further back, or maybe you want to elevate them slightly on berms so that butterflies are flying over traffic rather than through traffic, or maybe you want to change your mowing schedules along the roadsides so that you're not mowing down those plants when caterpillars are using them. So I think that ultimately roadsides are probably producing more animals than they're killing, but there are ways that we can manage them better to further tip that balance in favor of habitat.
Yeah, that's such an interesting technical problem because I guess there are basically two categories of technical problem. There's one which is how do you make the road as invisible as possible, and then there's another which is how do you use the habitat that's there. Like it's a lot of land taken up on its face, so how do you use that habitat as much as you can?
Yeah, exactly. I think about that question a lot in the context of scavengers too, right? I mean, we've turned our highways into these linear carcass trails, and that's a benefit to some species. Golden eagles, bald eagles, ravens, magpies, coyotes, right? Lots of scavenging animals are using those roadsides, but again, it's a really dangerous problem, and if you're a golden eagle with a belly full of venison, it takes you a minute to achieve liftoff, and you're at risk of being hit by a car yourself. And thousands of eagles actually get hit by vehicles every year. Again, another animal we don't really think about as being roadkill, but this huge source of mortality. And so there's a really cool study that I talk about in the book, done by a group called Hawkwatch International, where they basically they took those carcasses, those deer and elk and antelope, and they just dragged them 40 feet off of the roadside. And that was far enough so that, those eagles can land on those carcasses and feed on them in peace without having to flush off the carcass whenever a car drives by. And so that's just a really cool example, I think, of, okay, here's how we take this dangerous situation and a sad situation, which is roadkill, right? Not something that we want to happen. But, if it is going to happen, how do we make it a benefit to at least some species without creating a kind of a cascade of roadkill where those scavengers are being killed as well?
Yeah, that's such a great idea. I've struck by how a lot of the time the solutions to these things are actually pretty small, or pretty small scale rather.
Yeah, totally. I think that's a really good point too, because I think a lot of times when people think about mitigating roads for wildlife, they think about the big, sexy infrastructural solutions, right? The giant wildlife crossing, that's being built over the 101 in Los Angeles for mountain lions, for example, right? Probably the most famous wildlife crossing in the world at this point, which is going to be something like a $90 million project when all is said and done. And I love that sort of thing. I love those big beautiful overpasses. They're so effective, they're so important, but not every problem has to be solved that way necessarily. And certainly, not every situation can afford a $90 million overpass, right? And there's a lot we can do with the existing infrastructure that's already on the landscape. I think about all of those culverts out there, all of those little metal or concrete pipes that are funneling water under roadways. I mean, every one of those is a potential wildlife crossing, right? Just waiting for some fences on either side to guide animals to it and through it. There are places where transportation departments have put little kind of metal catwalks called critter shelves, through those culverts, so that animals can walk through those pipes without getting their paws wet. And those get used by bobcats and skunks and weasels and all kinds of animals, right? So yeah, let's build more of those big, beautiful overpasses. But as you say, there's a lot of smaller, cheaper tweaks and retrofits that we can do out there that will also make things a lot better for wildlife.
Are there any other takeaways you want people to have from the book about how roads are influencing our world?
Man, that's a good question. I think, yeah. I mean, again, I come back to people as well, right? And that the last chapter of the book is about Syracuse, New York, which is a city where big interstate highway I-81 was built, in the 1950s and 60s. And you could tell the story about Minneapolis or Miami or Buffalo or a million other cities where urban freeways were very deliberately built through communities of color, basically designed to drive out people of color who white officials considered undesirable. And that was what happened in Syracuse. This big freeway, this big elevated viaduct I-81 went in, and it was very intentionally routed through the 15th Ward, the oldest Black community in the city. And fast forward 60 years, and Syracuse is still one of the most segregated cities in the country, because that big viaduct is running through it and kind of dividing Black and white communities, and also contributing all very high rates of noise pollution and air pollution, and lowering students' standardized test scores, right? I mean, the legacy of this infrastructure is really immense and long. But there's a fantastic plan to basically tear down that freeway and route it around the city and replace it with kind of an at-grade boulevard with homes and small businesses and churches and other community elements. So that's what I would, that's to me that's one of the big takeaways from this book, is that like wild animals, we humans are profoundly affected, often very negatively, by roads, but we can still do something about it. This concrete jungle that we've created for ourselves, isn't necessarily permanent. We can still rectify some of the historic mistakes that we made.
The book is Crossings: How Road Ecology is Shaping the Future of Our Planet. It's our Wild Green Book Club recommendation for this month, and you can find a link to purchase your own copy in the description of this episode. Ben Goldfarb, thanks for coming on the show.
Hey, Rhett, it was a pleasure. Thank you so much.
Thanks for listening. Until next time, I'm Rhett.
And I'm Ben.
And happy Year of the Frog.